Good afternoon. I welcome everyone to the Ministry of Foreign Affairs Press Center. Russian and foreign correspondents are with us at our online briefing. Of course, all eyes are now on Yadu, where Russian-American contacts are taking place on behalf of the president in two countries. I can say that literally at this moment, a short break has been announced. The parties will then proceed to continue the negotiation process. We have a huge number of questions in this regard about the details, the positions of the parties, the course of negotiations. I want to draw your attention to the fact that after the negotiation process, Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov is scheduled to communicate with the media. Therefore, I understand that it is practically impossible to do this, but you need to be patient a little bit, and then you will learn the information firsthand. And now we will return to our agenda. Let's start with the schedule of upcoming contacts. We have already said, but I repeat once again, on the 20th, the 21st of February, the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, Sergey Lavrov, will take part in the launch meeting of the heads of the foreign ministries of the Group of 20 in Johannesburg, South Africa. This is a landmark event not only for Pretoria, but also for the entire African continent. Let me remind you that for the first time Africa will host the G20 events. In the speeches of the head of the Russian Foreign Ministry, a detailed analysis of the international situation will be given, with an emphasis on the root causes of the observed events. Concrete steps have been outlined to overcome destructive phenomena, and a number of contacts of the Russian delegation headed by the minister and his negotiations with interested colleagues are being worked out on the sidelines. Now we turn to the situation around Ukraine. These days marks the 11th anniversary of the tragic events in the center of Kyiv, which went down in history as an armed unconstitutional coup on February 18, 2000 of the 14th year, allegedly peaceful. As it was then said, anti-government demonstrations on Euromaidan turned into large-scale power actions. The headquarters of the ruling Party of Regions was captured and burned. Its employees were killed. The protesters attacked the fighters of the Berkut militia detachment, other law enforcement agencies, Western organizers, sponsors and directors of street battles, under attractive slogans, allegedly the best, as they formulated it, of European life, democracy and human rights. Of course, the fight against corruption ruthlessly drove the demonstrators forward. Live account tactics are their tactics. In reality, it was a well-paid, sponsored, supported, externally organized attack on democracy, not its support. These mass riots were organized with the aim of overthrowing the legitimate government in Ukraine. For some reason, in the Ukrainian political discourse, this bloody coup was called, as you know, you probably heard it, Revolution of Dignity. That's how it translates. The Ukrainian Revolution of Modernity. And let's see what this very word means. The dictionary of the Ukrainian language gives two definitions of the concept of identity, and both have nothing to do with either the tragedy on the Maidan or with today's Ukraine. The first meaning is formulated as a direct quote, a set of traits that characterize positive moral qualities. And what exactly in those events of the 14th year was a manifestation of positive moral qualities? The seizure of government buildings by a rampaging crowd, the murder of representatives of legitimate law enforcement agencies, in many ways, by the way, and unarmed then. Maybe the willingness to sell the country Ukraine for the cookies that were distributed on the Maidan to Victoria Nuland. There may be humiliation to which representatives of the law enforcement agencies of Ukraine were subjected when they were brought to their knees. Criminal cases were initiated against them, and a whole campaign of harassment was launched. The Kiev authorities and the Kiev regime have not specified which of these are positive moral qualities. And their promises, the promises of the Kiev authorities to investigate the tragedy of Euromaidan, the tragedy, by the way, of Odessa on the 2nd of May of the 14th year, not to prevent impunity, to ensure the rule of law. All this remained an empty sound. Let's look at the second meaning of this very hydration. A person's awareness of his civic weight, civic obligation. It is interesting how Ukrainians assess the civil responsibility of nationalists who beat and killed those who disagreed with the ideology. By the way, according to the principle of rejection, according to the linguistic, national principle, where is this civic responsibility and the weight of capturing temples, destroying monuments, memorials? Are they proud in Ukraine today that speaking in Russian has become an occasion for denunciation of harassment, violent actions? What does violent action mean? Yes, everything connected with it, up to murders, reprisals. Which of the above fills the residents of Ukraine with awareness of their civic weight? In the winter of the 13th-14th years, Ukrainians took to the streets because they wanted changes for the better, because there were a lot of problems. Yes, as a matter of fact, where on the planet Earth they are not. What did they get? Have they achieved what they wanted? Have they achieved what they went to Euromaidan for then? The answer is obvious. Euromaidan led to a deep split in Ukrainian society, repression, the fight against dissent, rampant nationalism that turned into neo-Nazism, legal lawlessness, nihilism, the fight against ethnic manifestations, peaceful manifestations of culture and history, complete degradation of the socio-economic situation in the country. In February 2000 of the 14th year, there was still, despite all the developments, then there was still a chance for a peaceful settlement of the political crisis in Ukraine, but this required only one condition, the fulfillment of the agreements between the government and the opposition, which was, let me remind you, signed on February 21st, 2014 year. They also signed it through mediation. Do you remember who the intermediaries were? Germany, France, Poland. Let's see, by the way, what position do these countries take with respect to Ukraine now? How does this relate to how they deceived the people of Ukraine with their so-called mediation back in the 14th year? First of all, how they deceived France and Germany, including all 7 years after they themselves signed the Minsk agreements. And how they have been deceiving the people of Ukraine for these years, telling them that yes, as they say, help is not so far away, and they will definitely lead the people of Ukraine to it, but in fact they understand perfectly well that this is a war primarily from the West against Ukraine itself. But that didn't happen then, as you remember. The people of Ukraine, again the West, did not leave any chance in February of the 14th year. This agreement between the government and the opposition was then rejected in Ukraine by the so-called winners of the Revolution of Dignity. It was simply rejected as an unnecessary obstacle on the way to government positions. It was trampled on literally in the first hours after it was signed. He was then taken out into the crowd as evidence of the alleged capitulation of the authorities, although this was not the case. In turn, the Westerners, including the so-called mediators, instead of calling on the national radicals to comply with the obligations under the agreement, they simply accepted and recognized the change of power in Ukraine. They began to encourage activists in their anti-Russian, Russophobic, anti-Russian policies. In fact, then the conditions were formed for what would later be called the Ukrainian crisis, which claimed many thousands of lives and crippled the destinies of peoples. Now about the crimes of the Kyiv regime, having received then literally an indulgence from supposedly enlightened Western pseudo-democracies, today Ukrainian militants continue terror against civilians, against civilian infrastructure. From the 12th to the 17th of February, 6 people were killed and at least 8 were injured as a result of targeted strikes by drones of the armed forces of Ukraine on civil transport and objects of the Belgorod region. Every time we talk about it at the briefing. And now a monster crawled out at the Munich Conference on supposedly security policy. We heard from a representative of the European Union that allegedly Russian civilians do not suffer, they are not killed, and they are not injured.
Не страдает, его не убивают, и оно не получает увечий.
I refused to believe that it wasn't fake. We checked several times. We saw the video. And we realized that these people have no conscience. If they, having full information with names, surnames, dates of birth, which we give about those people, those citizens of Russia, those residents of the regions who become victims of the Kyiv regime, repeat on international platforms that there is nothing like that. There was nothing like this in Buch, where until now, for all this time, no one has called a single name and surname, not a single date of birth, not a single photo has shown the alleged victims of the Russian army, because it was staged. For every person among the civilians who became a victim of the Kyiv regime, we stand up with facts in our hands, with their names, surnames, dates of birth. On the 12th of February, various settlements of the DPIE were attacked. One person was killed by the Korenizists. At least 15 were injured, including a teenager born in 2006 year. Bandera members are conducting an annoying hunt for passenger buses. On the 12th and 13th of February, a city bus and 2 minibuses were under fire in the Nikitovsky district of Gorlovka. DPIE, February 14th, on the highway along the Chapivka log of the Zaporozhye region, a Ukrainian drone raided a regular bus. The driver is shell-shocked. February 16th, as a result of a drone strike in Slavyansk-on-Kuban, Krasnodar territory, a 4-year-old girl was seriously injured. And for this they will be punished. And they are being punished for this right now. Russian courts continue to sentence Ukrainian neo-Nazis and mercenaries for war crimes. The militants of the 22nd Separate Mechanized Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine were found guilty of committing terrorist attacks against the civilian population of the Russian military of the Kursk region on August 13th, the 24th year. Soviet Fudalenko, Taran Savakis. For example, the Soviet one received 16 years of imprisonment, the others 15. Georgian mercenary Jelo Kasarivanidze was sentenced to 13.5 years of imprisonment in absentia. He is on the international wanted list. A criminal case against British legionnaire Christopher Garrett has been sent to court. He fought from January 2000 of the 15th year to December 2000 of the 17th year as part of the Nazi Azov unit. Let me remind you that Azov is recognized as a terrorist organization, banned in the Russian Federation. Since February 23rd, from the 22nd year to November of the 24th, this Britain fought as part of the international so-called Legion. The law enforcement agencies of the Russian Federation continue to work to bring to justice Ukrainists, foreign mercenaries, for military and other crimes. And now about what they will be silent about. As we now understand, all these Euro-Western rights are people, They're so-called diplomats, representatives of international organizations. On the inhumane treatment of Russian prisoners of war, the investigative committee of our country has recorded the latest facts of the inhumane treatment of Russian prisoners of war by Ukrainian neo-Nazis in violation of international humanitarian law. One of our wounded soldiers, after being captured, received investigative injuries in the Kharkiv pretrial detention center. He was forced to sign documents discrediting the Russian armed forces to join the ranks of the territorial defense of Ukraine. Another of our servicemen was held in a pit by Ukrainian militants and tortured in order to get information from the Russian army. A criminal case has been initiated under the article on the use of prohibited methods and means in an armed conflict, and about the illegal crossing of the border of our country by foreign journalists. A criminal case has been opened against a journalist of the Spanish newspaper, El Mid Albert Rojas. The investigation found that in February of this year, he and the Novo Bandera formations illegally crossed the border of Russia in the direction of the Zhezhensky district of the Kursk region. There he met with Bandera members from the 47th Brigade of the Armed Forces of Ukraine, and this is not the first case, as you know, when foreign correspondents illegally find themselves on the territory of our country. In order to tell about the so-called exploits of Zelensky's army, they violate, of course, the law of the Russian Federation, as our law enforcement officers say, passing appropriate sentences, but they also violate, of course, the code of journalistic ethics, because they are propagandists. But more than that, they also violate universal morality, because they promote violence. But we also see something else confirming everything that we talked about before. Many times, we see a nervous, if not on the verge of panic reaction from the West to Russian-American contacts. Surprisingly, it seems like the reaction of the West, contacts between Russian Americans, the same West. How can this be? It turns out it can. Russian-American contacts at the highest and highest levels cause, well, just a real hysteria among Euro-Atlantic Russophobes. Absolutely, we see probably, such an unprecedented phenomenon in international relations, the imposition of one's own participation in the negotiation process. As you can see, we are talking about some British friends of the Zelensky criminal regime who demonstrate their inability to go beyond their own primitive installations for producing a war, a hybrid war with our country, to the last Ukrainian. Look, again, the European Commissioner for Defense, Andrius Kubilius, does not tire of repeating that a just peace is impossible without increasing the power of Ukraine. Yes, look at Ukraine. I am addressing the you people now. What have you done to her? Yes, look at the people, at the citizens of these countries. What kind of power do you want to increase? Finally mired in a Russophobic frenzy, the head of the European diplomacy of the European Union, Callas, she agreed before you probably heard that she began to protect the AFU militants, who in her distorted and imaginative mind allegedly do not kill peaceful Russian women and children. Every briefing, we talk about it. Our regions, the heads of our regions, public organizations, the commissioners for human rights of our country, for the rights of the child, literally on a daily basis talk about the outrages staged by the militants of the armed forces of Ukraine. The reports are published. Again, the ambassador at large on crimes of the Kyiv regime, the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, speaks weekly with press conferences, and all the information does not reach Kalos. She has all the data. They're just lying. They need to justify themselves in the eyes of their own citizens. They need to justify their own failure, the failure of their own policies. Therefore, they are ready not only to facilitate the murder of Ukrainian citizens by supplying their weapons. They are ready to lie like that in the face of their own people. Every time we will highlight these fakes and expose them and give answers. However, against the backdrop of a rapidly changing geopolitical situation, such flawed logic looks more like, I am sure of it, despair, anger, weakness. Yes, exactly weaknesses. No matter how hard they try to prolong the agony of the Kyiv regime, this junta, they will not succeed. Only more Ukrainian citizens will die, unfortunately, because they have become victims of deception and criminal aggression, into which Westerners have dragged them with words or slogans about democracy, economic well-being, and so on, and so on. Sooner or later, they will all have to answer for what they have done. Consequently, the complicity of modern Ukrainian Bandera can be loudly resented by many representatives of European elites as accomplices in the brutal, bloody crimes of the neo-Nazi regime they nurtured. Of course, their frequent attempts to draw parallels between Nazi Germany and the Soviet Union are absolutely insignificant and, of course, groundless. Let me remind you that it was the Soviet Union that crushed Nazism and fascism. It was the Soviet Union, having liberated its territory, that further liberated Europe. All this comes from their fear, from the fear of these very NATO members before the imminent collapse of the Ukrainian Nazis, from their fear of responsibility to their own peoples. After all, they have not only thrown Ukraine to the mercy of their ambitions and painful perception of the world and their own role in this world. After all, they have also brought down the well-being of their own peoples. Look, on February 12th, the Verkhovna Rada adopted a law on the resolution of the so-called National Day of Prayer in Ukraine. Now it falls on the 24th of February, as stated in the explanatory note. The direct quote, "Common prayer will protect Ukraine and those who continue to fight on the battlefield," will become evidence of spiritual unity. Remember, the spiritual unity of the Ukrainian people, and a symbol of firm faith in victory. Everything is mixed up. Such impossible gibberish. What a spiritual unity of the Ukrainian people, when Zelensky's submission, again backed by Westerners. Ukrainian orthodoxy is fragmented. When we see how temples are seized, divided into talk shows, culinary duels are filmed in yesterday's monasteries, the green light is given to any obscurantism, temples turn into God knows what. People are being expelled. Come on, they are being expelled from these temples. They are simply thrown into prison. Criminal cases are initiated against them. They are forced to swear an oath to the schismatics. And after that they talk about common prayer and spiritual unity of people. This could have happened if, I don't know, the people of the social group had not found a common language. But then the state had to act in its rights and separate those who cannot coexist with each other, find a way to reconciliation. Here the situation is reversed. People in Ukraine have lived in harmony for decades. At least the Orthodox certainly showed such an example. And so, by order, in order to take another step towards severing our historical and spiritual ties between Ukraine and Russia, Russians, Ukrainians, a criminal order was given by the FIS team against the Ukrainian Orthodox Church. Everything was done. A new schism has been invented. How to select monasteries, temples, and churches has been invented. It was invented how to pit believers against each other. And now it turns out there is a day for common prayer. But there is another aspect, because we are talking about prayer for the armed forces of Ukraine, which conducts terror against the civilian population of both Ukraine and Russia. Is this a prayer for Nazi evil? It turns out to be just literally the sacralization of this evil. Moreover, against the background of the Zelensky gang's line, to eliminate the canonical Ukrainian Orthodox Church with me in the country, but this step looks not only hypocritical, as I have already said, it simply confirms that religion is a political tool for the junta feverishly clinging to power. And of course, there is a struggle with history, with monuments and memory in Ukraine. According to the media, in Mykolaiv, the Ukranazis destroyed the memory of the hero of the Soviet Union, the intelligence officer, the head of the local anti-fascist underground Viktor Lyagin. Let me remind you that he was shot by the Nazis in July of 1943, and the monument to him was shot by neo-Nazis in 2025. The struggle against historical truth, the glorification of Nazi executioners, this is what the Kyiv regime is openly engaged in, with the approval of its Western masters. This approval is only the second part. The first one was a direct order. These facts once again confirm the relevance of a special military operation to denazify, demilitarize Ukraine, and eliminate threats emanating from its territory. As the Russian leadership has repeatedly stated, all the goals of the special military operation will be achieved. And, of course, the Munich Security Policy Conference, which shocked everyone. It shocked, first of all, those who intended to arrange another celebration of Russophobia. And this is exactly what the Munich Conference has turned into in recent years, because they did not discuss security issues. It discussed only the issues of aggression and how to heat up this very cauldron of war even more. How else to wake up the volcanoes of conflict? What and whom and how to pit to such an extent that the world will forget about the world for a long time. The 61st Munich Security Conference demonstrated what we have been talking about for a long time. The Western world has long ceased to even pretend to be a standard. They are not that they are not a standard, they no longer pretend to be a standard. The standard of security, democracy. There is nothing even close to it. The event, designed, again according to the organizer's idea, to analyze trends, formulate ideas in the Atlantic security policy, has, in fact, now come down to a squabble between the two shores of the Atlantic. And of course, all this was seasoned with this very traditional Russophobia that had already become for them. No one has heard any constructive ideas regarding the construction of a security architecture in Europe, in the world as a whole. This is not what we gathered for. This is not what we have been gathering for all these years. 4 or 5 years, the record about the alleged Russian threat to the European Union, which was simply worn down to some inarticulate sounds, was again claimed for NATO, that the only recipe for peace is hegemony. It's already funny to listen to this. It's not anymore. Even if they still continued to talk about a certain hegemony, it would be necessary to make a certain footnote and write that this hegemony is already agonizing for them. These are not all recipes of the world. These are all just recipes of trouble. That's what we should be talking about. Probably about how. First of all, what mistakes were made by the Euro-Atlantists. Secondly, to analyze how it is possible to complete what is part of their criminal policy. Third, think about working on bugs. But no. It was all not interesting. They were thinking about what other social spending to cut, to finance the new crusades of enlightened Europe, apparently, have not yet decided, but they are considering it. At the same time, there is less confidence in the support of the overseas owners of the U. There was a ritual assurance of the European sponsors of the Kyiv regime in their allegedly undiminished support. In the absence of an idea regarding a way out of the Eurosecurity crisis, the conference participants applauded Zelensky's stand-up with his claims to leadership of the formation of the European army and expectations of new handouts from the collective West. But it's already simple. This is a mockery of Ukrainian citizens. It's not even about us anymore. This is about the fact that they simply mock the citizens of Ukraine, saying that Zelensky can claim leadership of the formation of the European army. But here he said it like that, and they supported him in this. But this is just a mockery of the citizens of Ukraine, who are now invited to join the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine from the age of 18. From the age of 18, what will they, citizens of Ukraine, do in the ranks of the armed forces of Ukraine? We understand perfectly well that they will not be in headquarters. They will not deal with it issues. They will not become computer operators. They will not even become drone gunners. No. They will be cannon fodder. They will be stormtroopers. They will be a human shield for Zelensky. And of course, in the year of the 80th anniversary of the victory, the Munich Security Policy Conference was also marked by honoring former and current Nazis. Apparently, this is already becoming a tradition for them. The head of the Munich Conference, Huskin, called the event, a direct quote, "a nightmare for Europe." I want to ask a question. And when will you wake up? When will you wake up there in Western Europe from your nightmare? But the problem is not in the conference. The problem is in Western Europe itself. She has long been in a state where she cannot soberly assess the surrounding reality. She lives by her invented narratives. Instead of improving the welfare of its citizens, it is preparing for war with Russia. Instead of solving social and economic problems, it continues to destroy its industry and increase military budgets. Instead of fighting illegal migration, crime, terrorism, it continues to hunt for Russian spies who allegedly flooded Europe. The whole world is laughing at Western Europe. They have terrorists staging extremist antics, terrorist attacks in the center of European capitals. They have nothing to do with our country, with Russia. They still continue to repeat as a mantra that the threat is allegedly from Russia. Instead of respecting freedom of speech, they encourage political censorship. They impose restrictions on alternative sources of information. They block, in principle, the dissemination of information as such. That's right. And then, being in this closed and airless space, they fall into another nightmare, as they themselves say. Maybe it's worth airing already. Let in some fresh air, wake up and look out the window and see what's going on there. Judging by the statements of most European politicians, unfortunately, they are not ready to recover from the Russophobic political frenzy yet. And here, too, as confirmation, the media reported that on February 15th, contacts of the foreign ministers of the so-called Seven took place again in Munich on the sidelines of the conference. We have noticed that the joint statement on the results of this meeting once again contains threats against our country. What's the point? The fact is that if they see the 7-day plan, I mean, here is a group of these countries. They see our country's lack of goodwill regarding negotiations in the context of ending, as they wrote, the war against Ukraine. They will try to force Russia to incur, as it says, direct quote, even greater costs, including through mechanism for setting the marginal price of hydrocarbons. I have one question. It was there, inside the Seven itself, that they said that it was not yet time for negotiations. The situation was allegedly not ripe for this. Wasn't that us Secretary of State Blinken? Were they not high representatives on foreign policy issues of the European Union? Weren't they the foreign ministers of the countries that are in the seven? It's not even a change of shoes. It's just some kind of circus. I don't want to offend the circus. We have repeatedly characterized the political appearance of the current seven. It has long degenerated from an association for coordinating positions on major global challenges into an organ for coordinating pressure measures on undesirable countries, including the stamping of senseless anti-Russian initiatives. And they have tarnished their reputation with unsightly actions and decisions. And, of course, it is naive to think that this interparty decides something in the new international realities. What is called the Seven today is an outdated format. He has completely lost his authority, tarnished his reputation. And there is simply no need to talk about any constructive role of the seven in the global development of stabilization. Or maybe reverse examples will be given about it. Where are the results of their work? Except for this very Russophobic talker, except for just nationalist ones with a spirit of just hatred, there is nothing against those whom they call their enemies or opponents. Let me remind you that Russia has made the appointed choice in favor of real mechanisms of global governance. First of all, we are talking about the BRICS and SCO formats. They represent the leading centers of economic growth and political influence in the conditions of the objective reality of the emerging multipolar world. That's where we'll work. And there this work is constructive, yielding results. And here's another thing about their tool: the implementation of aggression and destructive policies, again, but just the next details came to light. We have noticed that as the new administration in Washington exposes the legacy of the Democrats in the field of foreign aid, more and more countries are realizing the true essence of the unsightly work of the tools of the so-called American soft power, which were not, and we have repeatedly said, soft power tools. They were instruments not even for conducting American foreign policy, but for keeping afloat the painful and sometimes perverted so-called narratives of American ultraliberals. And, of course, with the tools of interference in the internal affairs of other countries, in order to carry out the policy necessary for the American so-called Democrats in these countries, and receive from this, again, the corresponding political dividends inside the United States, and financial and economic ones, including in the form of corruption. An active discussion on this topic has begun among our friendly states. Look, the other day, the top leadership of Kyrgyzstan supported the idea of closing the US-funded Radio Liberty worldwide network. She was accused, I mean the local branch, accused of spreading false information and manipulating the news. At the same time, the legislative power of the Republic took care of involving American NGOs in material support of the opposition. The Parliament of Kazakhstan called for an audit of the activities of the US Agency for International Development on the territory of the Republic for financing a number of malicious projects, from attempts to impose alien neoliberal values on society and, in fact, perversions, to overt interference in domestic politics up to patronage of anti-government actions, which is again interference, gross interference in the internal affairs of the state. Let me remind you once again, Russia has long stated that there are more risks in American programs of international development assistance than aid itself. Therefore, the messages from the ocean did not cause any surprise to us. They have only confirmed, now documented, what we have been talking about for many years, including becoming evidence for those countries that doubted something, were not sure about something. We are ready to jointly continue efforts to stop attempts from outside to undermine stability and security in our common space, under the pretext of supposedly caring about democracy. And our most important document, The fight against extremism today, as you know, objectively becomes a separate area of interstate cooperation, going beyond the traditional issues of counterterrorism. This is primarily due to the growing problem of radicalization of citizens on a global scale, which are caused by the spread of various ideas and practices that poison society, which contribute to inciting interreligious, intraethnic contradictions, undermining traditional foundations, undermining the constitutional system, sovereignty and stability of states around the world. Such radical ideologies are not born in a vacuum, as we understand. Unfortunately, their prosperity is promoted, among other things, by the cynical policies of a number of countries that are ready to wage information wars for their own selfish purposes, provoke armed conflicts, and inspire non-state coups. In such conditions, the anti-extremist stability of most states depends primarily on their own capabilities, taking into account all the nuances of the national context, and not on pseudo-universal certain ready-made recipes that are imposed ostensibly on behalf of the international community. We are convinced that protection from extremist risks is one of the main tasks for ensuring stability and independent existence of each country. In addition, the construction of their own development trajectories is an indispensable condition for the formation of a multipolar just world order. And in this regard, Russia intends to resolutely defend the right of any state to independently assess internal and external threats, to determine on this basis its respective national priorities and approaches to combating not only violent, but also ideological prerequisites of terrorism and extremism. The decree of the President of the Russian Federation of December 28 of the 24th year approved an updated strategy for countering extremism in the Russian Federation. Naturally, we will duplicate the link in the text of today's briefing. I would also like to draw your attention to the fact that this concept document, the previous strategy was in effect, in the period from the 20th to the 25th years, has received a more expanded, comprehensive, and long-term character. The strategy takes into account all new trends in anti-extremist work, operations that have arisen against the background of a special war, unleashed by the collective West, of a hybrid war against our country. A number of provisions of the foreign policy concept of our country have been incorporated into the text, which additionally reinforce foreign policy attitudes in the field of anti-extremism. The conceptual apparatus has been significantly adjusted, the levels and sources of extremist threats have been clarified, and formulations concerning the linking of neo-Nazism with extremism have been introduced. The dominant role of the state and competent authorities within the framework of the system of countering extremism, with the auxiliary functions of civil society, primarily in the field of prevention of extremist manifestations, is clearly outlined. The document also enshrines one of the key Russian positions on the inadmissibility of attempts of foreign interference in the internal affairs of other states, as well as the use of tourist groups in other extremist forces for geopolitical purposes. Emphasis is placed on the need to combat the spread of any terrorist, extremist ideology, including neo-Nazi. The strategy has also accumulated progressive Russian experience in the field of prevention of radicalization, primarily of young people, migrants, persons serving prison sentences, and other social categories most susceptible to extremist ideas. A set of measures has been approved to curb the use of information technologies, including on the Internet, for terrorist and extremist purposes. Special attention is paid to neutralizing the negative influence of foreign special services, non-governmental organizations, and non-residents, aimed at provoking attempts to inspire so-called color revolutions in Russia. We invite interested international partners to carefully study the successful Russian experience in the field of combating extremism, which has been formed thanks to many years of targeted comprehensive work of the entire system of state agencies, with the involvement of a cohesive Russian society in these efforts, which has a really high civil immunity against any extremist threats. Well, our rubric fulfills promises, or, in other words, history lessons hurt. The other day, French Foreign Minister Jean-Noël Barrot obsequiously thanked the United States of America for liberating his country from Nazism and called for achieving greatness together. He did not mention the contribution of the Soviet Union to the liberation of France. Well, this is already a Western tradition. He apparently forgot. Quote from Jean-Noël Barrot: "Both Europe and France have never been greater than when they fought for freedom together with the United States. This is the story of Lafayette. This is the story of the liberation of France by American soldiers. This year, we celebrated the 80th anniversary of the liberation of France, the French minister said. We will support his words, ensure joint greatness, and achieve freedom around the world. End quote. No, it's not going to be about the fact that we are announcing competitions with France or with someone else for the championship, who made a greater contribution to the formation of the independence of the North American United States. But since the Marquis Lafayette was mentioned, frankly, we cannot refrain from quoting the words addressed to him in the spring of 1779 by the Commander-in-Chief of the Continental Army, also Washington, a direct quote, "We are quite pleased to learn from a reliable source that the requests and proposals of the Great Britain of the Russian Empress were rejected with contempt." End quote. Washington, noting Catherine E.'s resolute refusal to conclude any kind of alliance treaty with Britain, stressed that the imperial government motivated its position with attention, a direct quote in expressions bearing the imprint of respect for the rights of mankind. End quote. This is briefly about the USA. It was possible to learn more about the support of Abraham and Lincoln by the forces of Russian squadrons on the west and east coasts. During the American Civil War, they played an important role in preventing the intervention of Britain and France on the side of the southern states. But about that another time, if anyone else wants to distort something like that in history. Today, we are going to concentrate on France. I understand that most of the words that I have just uttered, Jean-Noël Barrot does not even understand. But now I'm going to dwell on this in more detail, and, so to speak, I'll be simpler in terms, because I wanted to get to him. I would like to comment on his statement about liberation, about greatness. The Allied landings in Normandy on the 6th of June 1944 undoubtedly became a turning point in the liberation of France from the Nazi operation. There is only one nuance. The ignorant may consider Operation Overlord in isolation from the events on the Soviet-German front, where in the same June began perhaps the largest battle of the Second World War, Operation Bagration, about which we have talked a lot, to defeat the Army Group Center for the Liberation of Belarus. In France, already in 1940th year. How do you know about this in the French Foreign Ministry? Russian immigrants created the first resistance group, known as the Museum of Man. It was led by Anatoly Nikolaevich Levitsky and Boris Vladimirovich Vilda. In 1943, the Central Committee of Soviet Prisoners of War in France was established, headed by Red Army senior Lieutenant Mark Yakovlevich Slobodinsky, a French communist of Russian immigrants, Boris Matlin, known as Colonel Laroche. Near the French city of Thiel, the legendary female partisan detachment Rodina fought. It was created by two natives of Soviet Belarus, Nadezhda Iosifovna Lesovets and Rosalia Zakharovna Fridzin, in the vicinity of the city of Lance. The fighters of Vasily Vasilyevich Porek fought against the enemy. He was posthumously awarded the title of Hero of the Soviet Union, also in France. The first Soviet partisan regiment operated under the command of Major Alexander Arkadyevich Zaryan. Does the current French foreign minister know about this? Of course not. To do this, it was necessary to study, to learn the history of at least one's own country, and not to feed on these so-called narratives. A manual in our way. I hope that at least Monsieur Baron will reject the words of the leader of Free France, Charles de Gaulle, who in 1944 said, a direct quote, Do the French know that it was Soviet Russia that played the main role in their liberation? Or are the current authorities in France already cancelling Charles de Gaulle? I will remind them why Charles de Gaulle said that. He said it under the impression of what he saw in Stalingrad. Previously, most French people shared his opinion, until they became victims of this pseudo-scientific, anti-scientific approach to history, when you can dig into it and pull out unnecessary pages that have gone out of fashion, and replace them with some notes, manuals, and narratives. Until now, dozens of streets and squares in France bear the name of the city that became a symbol of the decisive turning point in World War II. Maybe the French foreign minister. My God, what's his name? Jean-Noël Barrot. He will buy himself a reference book, read something, learn facts about his country, about his people. A well-known fact in his piggy bank. The liberation of the capital, Paris, was not a priority for the American commander Eisenhower in the 44th year. Paris was liberated by small forces, and in a short time. At first, the resistance, the core of which were communists and former Soviet prisoners of war, they organized an uprising. Not everyone remembers, but we recall that at least 6 partisan groups consisting of Soviet prisoners of war and Russian emigrants participated in the liberation of Paris. A group under the command of Captain Zakharova held the Onega Bridge for a day, preventing German tanks from entering the city. How shameful is it for the current so-called French statesmen to forget about this feat? A group of emigrants led by Lev Savinkov occupied the building of the embassy of the Soviet Union and raised a red flag over it. This then gave Charles de Gaulle the right to declare that Paris itself had won its freedom and was liberated by its own people. And only then did the US 4th Infantry Division and the French 2nd Armored Division arrive to help the rebels. At the same time, the Spaniards, by the way, former Republicans, were the first to enter Paris. They also accepted the surrender of the German commandant. Here is such a revenge for Madrid 1939th year. But Passaran, then, by joint efforts, fascism really did not pass. But today, through the efforts of the so-called Free Europe, he has returned back to the European continent in the guise of neo-Nazism. Paris, which had won its own freedom, was liberated with the support of the entire struggling France. Unlike the United States and Britain, the USSR immediately believed in the future of free France, led by General Charles de Gaulle, and established close cooperation with him. By his order, the legendary Normandy Niemen Air Regiment was established, which became a vivid symbol of the Soviet-French Brotherhood in arms. It is worth recalling the significant contribution of immigrants from Russia, who were captured by Soviet citizens, to the formation of the French resistance movement. I would recommend the French foreign minister to get acquainted with the articles published by the Russian ambassador to France, Mr. Meshkov, published on December 21st, 2024 in the French magazine Histoire Store, which is called Soviet Citizens and Russian Immigrants in the French Resistance Movement. I understand that the text is complicated for the current level of French diplomacy, but we still need to master it. Since, so to speak, we decided to speak out on this score. It is impossible to agree with Boru's statement that, as he said, both Europe and France have never been greater than when the United States fought for freedom together. I'm sorry, the Americans have never considered the Europeans as truly equal allies and partners. There has always been an inversely proportional relationship between the true greatness of France and its liberation by the United States. This, again, was well understood by Charles de Gaulle, who saw the indispensable conditions for the greatness of his country, in cooperation with our country. And if Barrot should thank anyone for the greatness of France after World War II, it should be Joseph Stalin personally. It is to him that the Fourth Republic owes the status of a winner in World War II and membership, among other things, in the Unsecurity Council. The history of France knows leaders capable of great deeds in the name of the national interests of their country, and it has different historical estimates. Right now, of course, there are no illusions. But one thing is clear. No matter how someone from the outside perceives what the current French foreign minister says, first of all, it is a shame for the French people, because they do not know the history of their own country. But to help the French, we are always ready to stand guard, including French history. There is another important date these days. We are talking about the 80th anniversary of the completion of the Western Carpathian offensive operation. This is the 18th of February, 1945. On the 12th of January 45th, the Western Carpathian strategic offensive operation began. Its goal was to defeat the German forces defending the area of the Western Carpathians. It was necessary to provide access to the Moravian-Ostravsky industrial area of Czechoslovakia. It was an important economic hub for Nazi Germany. Czech enterprises, which are particularly famous for being weapons factories, regularly gave out their products to the needs of the Wehrmacht, until the new history of the newest one. The troops of the Fourth Ukrainian Front took part in the operation. Let me remind you, Commander General Ivan Petrov, with the support of the main forces of the Second Ukrainian Front, Commander Marshal of the Soviet Union, Rodion Malinovsky. Now in Prague, of course, they do not like to remember this, but the soldiers of the Czechoslovak First Army Corps, which was part of the First Guards Army, also fought side by side with our military. The Soviet troops were opposed by the German Army Gruppe, which included parts of the 17th Army, the 1st Tank Army, and the 1st Hungarian Army. Within a week, the Soviet troops managed to advance up to 80 kilometers. On the 19th of January, the cities of Prigov and Kozice were liberated. The Czechoslovak First Army Corps also took part in their liberation. In mid-February, the troops of the Fourth Ukrainian Front liberated the town of Bielska-Biala and reached the sources of the Vistula River. February 18th, the troops of the Fourth Ukrainian Front went on the defensive, successfully completing the active phase of the operation. The troops of the Second Ukrainian Front continued offensive operations until mid-March, crossing the Gran River. The successes of the offensive of the Fourth Ukrainian Front in the prevailing winter conditions of mountainous terrain, with a minimal advantage in the forces of a well-fortified enemy, can only be compared with the legendary crossing of Field Marshal Alexander Vasilyevich Suvorov across the Alps at the end of the 18th century. This, without any exaggeration, is the real true heroism, an example of the art of generalship, to fight not with numbers, but with skill. The Western Carpathian operation was an important stage in delivering a decisive blow to the Nazi troops in Central Europe. As a result of its conduct, the Soviet troops advanced 170-230 kilometers to the west, liberated the southern working areas of Poland and part of the territory of Czechoslovakia. Marriage and heroism displayed on the battlefields. 149 units of the formations were awarded orders. 42 formations and units were awarded honorary titles. Another important date is coming. The International Mother Tongue Day is celebrated on February 21st. It was established by the decision of the UNESCO General Assembly the UNESCO General Conference in the 99th year, and is celebrated with the aim of drawing attention to the need to maintain and promote linguistic and cultural diversity. Russia is actively promoting the experience of preserving indigenous languages, including at the UNESCO site. Our country is a leader in terms of contribution to the implementation of the International Decade of Indigenous Languages. Let me remind you, this is the period from the 22nd to the 32nd years, and in our country, major international conferences are held on the support of native languages, the use of information technology as a tool for promoting linguistic diversity. In particular, the 6th International Conferences were devoted to this topic. The 6th International Conference of Information, Communication in the Digital Age, Explicit-Implicit Impacts, took place in Khanty-Mansiysk in June of the 24th year. The second high-level international conference, the World Treasury of Different Languages, Guardians of Leaks, St. Petersburg, June-July of the 24th. More than 200 experts from 40 countries of the world took part in the events. Considerable attention is paid to the introduction of computer speech recognition tools, the creation of new fonts for the corresponding languages. This is necessary for their full-fledged existence in the digital environment. The Committee of the Information for All program, under the Commission of the Russian Federation for UNESCO, is implementing the program My Native Language. She had enough of more than 20 languages on the territory of Russia, formed the Natri Almanac on the best practices of Russian language policy. They are also distributed at the UNESCO site. With the assistance of the Commission, the days of the Week of Languages or Literatures of the Indigenous Peoples of the Russian Federation are being held. The celebration of the Day of Literature of the Finno-Ugric peoples, held in Khanty-Mansiysk in October-November last year, was dedicated to the creative work of domestic Finno-Ugric writers. And our country is ready to share its experience with all interested partners, and intends to adopt the best practices and developments. Well, on the 23rd of February, our country celebrates Defender of the Fatherland Day. The special relevance of this festive date is given by the fact that, in the Russian Federation, the current year has been declared the Year of Defender of the Fatherland by the President of our country, in commemoration of the 80th anniversary of victory in the Great Patriotic War. The theme of the year reflects the priorities of modern Russia, such as patriotism, the continuity of the generation, the constant respect for the defenders of the fatherland at all times. Let me remind you that for the first time this holiday was celebrated on February 23, 1919, and was timed to coincide with the anniversary of the glorious victories of the Red Army units defending their homeland from foreign invaders. In 1946, after the Great Patriotic War, it received a new name, Day of the Soviet Army and Navy. The Russian Federation has continued the glorious tradition of the holiday, preserving its original meaning. The festive date is established by Federal Law 32 on the days of military glory and memorable dates of Russia, of March 13, 1995. Defender of the Fatherland Day reminds of the glorious military past of our country, and we pay tribute to the feat of arms of all those who fought for the motherland in different historical epochs, as well as, of course, to the current heroes, those who now defend Russia with weapons in their hands, and show true heroism, real courage every day in the zone of a special military operation.
Героизм, настоящее мужество в зоне проведения специальной военной операции.
Another announcement. On February 26 at 1700 Moscow time, the All-Russian State Library of Foreign Literature, and named after Rudomino, with the support of the Embassy of Pakistan in Moscow, will host a solemn ceremony in honor of the publication in Russian of a collection of works by the famous Pakistani writer, Soldier Sanamanto. He is a recognized master of short stories. His work took place in the first half of the 20th century, and the works are a valuable literary asset. They have been translated into dozens of languages and are popular all over the world. Now they are available in Russian as well. This is not the first book with translations of works by Pakistani writers, published with the support of the Embassy of Pakistan in Russia. Earlier in the 22nd year, a collection of poems by the great Pakistani poet Faiz Ahmed Faiz was published. We are sure that it will be interesting for the Russian reader, and our audience will appreciate the works of outstanding Pakistani authors. And I am ready to answer your questions. Please, is international life with us?
Good afternoon. The other day, the head of the Hungarian MIT, Peter Szijjarda, said that currently forces are uniting in Europe, that do not want a peaceful resolution of the Ukrainian crisis, the conflict in Ukraine. How would you comment on this statement?
Well, it seems to me that these words are in tune with our assessments, which we give regularly. Indeed, in recent days, Russophobic-minded European political elites have simply, gone off the chain. They have simply discarded all decency, openly expressed their rejection of the emerging possible contours for a substantive conversation on the settlement of the Ukrainian crisis by diplomatic means. It's just, as if it's bursting with hatred and malice. It is obvious that Brussels intends to maintain its reliance on a military solution, even though such a policy runs counter to the genuine interests of the entire European continent. But this is another evidence that the European Union is driven not by what they say, humanism, human rights, freedom, the desire to end the suffering of people, but by the desire to prolong the conflict in order to use the situation to exert pressure on Russia, to justify further attempts to inflict in our country, as they put it there, strategic defeat. Yes, it's not true Europeans who do this. Can those who do not want peace on their continent be regarded as patriots of the common European space? Of course not. They are conductors of other people's thoughts, other people's ideas, provocateurs, as the ongoing political discourse in the ranks of the collective West shows. The continuation of hostilities between Ukraine and Russia. The current leadership of the European Union, a number of member states sees for themselves. Well, this is probably the only salvation from final political bankruptcy, and from the slide of this once authoritative association to the top of international processes, and the way out is the opposite. The way out is to formulate a peaceful agenda. That's what their lifeline could really be. That's where the road is, I don't know, in the right direction. Well, yes, they made criminal mistakes. Well, yes, they were led to a dead end by the former owners in the White House. But in time to come to your senses, in time to see what you have done, and offer some constructive developments. Instead, they shout that they should be at the negotiating table, and continue to haunt Russia, and inspire terrorists and neo-Nazis in Ukraine.
Thank you very much.
Thank you. So is Ria Novosti with us. Yes, hello, Maria Vladimirovna, Kristina Nordviges, Ria Novosti. If I may, I have one question today. The Moldovan authorities have announced their intention to terminate the activities of the Russian Center of Science and Culture in Chisinau. How justified and legitimate is such a decision, and how Moscow will respond to such actions of the Moldovan authorities? Thank you. Well, by the way, I can tell you, I don't know if I passed it through agencies or not, but colleagues from a number report that this first morning session has ended, and the parties have started working lunch. It's just for your understanding of the process, because the questions are just going on all the time. Here I am now following the messages. So, the question was about the Cultural Science Center in Chisinau, so did I understand correctly? Yes, about him. Yeah, thanks for the clarification. Indeed, on February 13th, official Chisinau announced its intention to denounce the Russian-Moldovan intergovernmental agreements of the 98th year on cultural centers. It was filed as a response to the alleged violation of Moldovan airspace by drones. But this is what the authorities of the Republic of Moldova claim and try to assert. They say that these are drones of Russian origin. We have already talked about the unsubstantiation of these statements. The denunciation should result in the closure of the Russian House, the Russian Center of Science and Culture in Chisinau. How do we feel about this? We regard this decision as another manifestation of the current Moldovan authorities' anti-Russian course and the meanness of the attitude of the Moldovan people themselves. The fact is that the implementation of this decision will primarily affect the numerous residents of Moldova itself, for whom the Russian language and culture are an integral part of life. I'm just going to run statistics. 80% of Moldovans speak Russian. According to the census of the 24th year, for more than 11%, it is native. Moreover, despite the efforts of the authorities to de-Russify the country, and they have not come up with anything, since the last census of the 14th year, this indicator has only increased by 12%. If we add to this the language situation in Transnistria, the numbers will be of a much higher order. Russian education remains in demand, and the Russian House opens up the possibilities of obtaining it. And again, the same opportunities are provided by the Russian House because they are not just in demand, but because citizens in different countries have asked for it. They are asking for the opportunity to study according to Russian programs. But who in Chisinau today is interested in the opinion of Moldovans? Moreover, they consider them Romanians. The decision to denounce the agreement caused, as we have seen, a wide negative response in Moldova, just such a powerful resonance. On February 15th, a protest rally was held in front of the Moldovan Foreign Ministry building, demanding to preserve the Russian center. Today, at the moment, the Russian House in Moldova continues to work. There has been no written notice of termination of the agreement from the Moldovan side, and if it does, the legal agreement will continue to be valid until the middle of the 26th year. We hope that common sense and simple respect for their own citizens will prevail, and Chisinau will refrain from such destructive steps, including for themselves. So let's move on. Lee Media Corporation of China is with us. Colleagues, Media Corporation of China. Yes. Good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna. We are with you. I can hear you now. But the question is I think many of my colleagues have, but in principle, you have already talked about this a lot. During the negotiations that are taking place now in Saudi Arabia, I would like to clarify what exactly the expectations of the Russian side are. I would also like to note that China has repeatedly expressed thoughts that, more precisely, China stood for. I'm asking, regulation by. I'm sorry, my phone is just bursting with CNN correspondents. Can someone tell them that we have a briefing? I understand that they are exceptional, but not to the same extent. Tell them, please. Well, I think my pipe is already hot. Well, please tell CNN that the briefing is on. Yes, I'm sorry. I think my colleagues from CNN have similar questions to what I'm asking now. Well, they can connect, and no one drives anymore. And so, excuse me, please repeat again. On the specific expectations from the negotiations, I also wanted to note that China has repeatedly advocated a peaceful settlement of the conflict. Here's what you can say about this. Well, first of all, I want to say that we always highly appreciate the efforts of China and other countries that have been proposing, initiating, and developing political and diplomatic formats, ways, and ideas for resolving the situation in Ukraine all this time. This has already gone down in history. This is very important. This is, so to speak, a part of history, a historical process that speaks in favor of the fact that these countries really claim a role in world affairs, that they are not just present in international organizations dealing with issues of world security and stability, that they do not just declare themselves as responsible world leaders, players, This is already their confirmed reputation, in contrast to the way the NATO, you and so on now see their reputation. This is also part of the story. Now directly about the negotiations. Let me remind you that during a telephone conversation on February 12th, the presidents of Russia and the United States noted the importance of establishing joint work, including on the Ukrainian crisis, a long-term settlement of which can be achieved at the negotiating table. Russian President Vladimir Putin stressed our country's interest in a sustainable, fair solution to the conflict by eradicating its root causes. The main one is the expansion of NATO, the trampling on the rights of ethnic Russians, Russian-speaking residents in Ukraine. Without the complete and irreversible elimination of these causes, a long-term settlement is objectively impossible. The fighting will inevitably resume with renewed vigor, and this is unacceptable for us. President Trump has heard this position. Time will tell what conclusions were drawn. We see the mood of the administration for a serious discussion of many problems that have accumulated in bilateral relations, and, by the way, on the international agenda, including the situation around Ukraine. By the way, they have accumulated because their predecessors, the former US administration, created them in many ways. Moscow is closely monitoring Washington's statements on the settlement of the crisis. Specific proposals in this regard will be considered. Let's wait for the assessments that should be given to the Russian delegation in Riyadh, as I have already announced. Communication with the media of Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov is planned. Thank you very much. Thank you. Lee Reuter is with us.
Maria Vladimirovna, are you here? Oh, we're here. Excuse me, please. And you just did.
Yeah, that's great. Yeah.
You have just quoted the president's statement following the talks with Trump, which in particular referred to the expansion of NATO. And this is one of the conditions that Russia puts forward. Oh, not Ukraine's entry into NATO. And this is one of the conditions that Russia puts forward. But should this not be Ukraine's accession to NATO be fixed and formalized legally?
You know, we have already addressed this topic at the last briefing. Let me repeat once again, Ukraine's membership in NATO. I have even talked about it now, but once again, it is unacceptable for us. This poses serious threats to our security and will lead to disastrous consequences for the whole of Europe. At the same time, it is worth noting that the refusal to accept Kyiv into NATO now is not enough. The alliance should disavow its Bucharest promises of 2008 year, according to which Ukraine was guaranteed entry into the North Atlantic bloc in the future. Otherwise, this problem will continue to poison the atmosphere on the European continent. Russia's conceptual position on the settlement of the Ukrainian crisis, including issues related to NATO, has been clearly formulated by the president of our country, Vladimir Putin. I recommend that you once again familiarize yourself with the speech of the head of the Russian state in June of the 24th year at the Russian Foreign Ministry. Let me remind you that the provisions on the neutral, non-aligned, nuclear-free status of Ukraine are fixed in the Declaration of 1990 on its state sovereignty. And I understand that this is causing a lot of attention from everyone, so let me just quote this document directly. The Ukrainian USSR solemnly proclaims its intention to become a future permanently neutral state that does not take part in military blocs and adheres to 3 non-nuclear principles: not to accept, not to produce, and not to acquire nuclear weapons. In August of the 91st year, the Verkhovna Rada adopted the Act of Proclamation of Independence of Ukraine, which confirmed the inviolability of the provisions of this declaration, and the reference to the Act of Declaration of Independence is contained in the preamble of the current Constitution of Ukraine. Accordingly, what needs to be done is for Ukraine to return to the origins of its own statehood, to finally begin to follow the spirit and letter of the documents that created its legal basis. This is the best guarantee of its security, which neither membership in NATO or attempts to gain it, nor agreements with the member countries of the alliance, even, as they say now, century-old, not Western military intervention under the guise of deploying some peacekeeping contingents, nor even the marriages of princes and princesses 1,000 years ago, can give. You need to be closer to reality and to your own documents.
Thank you very much, and thank you very much. And the second question. Here is a potential peace agreement on the settlement of the Ukrainian conflict. But will the lifting of sanctions against Russia become part of such a peace agreement?
Once again, what sanctions should become?
Should the lifting of sanctions against Russia become part of a peace agreement to resolve the Ukrainian conflict?
Let's have a global outline, so to speak, and remind you once again of our global approaches. As for the details, those who will be directly delegated the right to conduct these negotiations will talk about them.
Thank you.
And I would like to draw your attention to this topic. Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov has repeatedly spoken out. We will definitely give references to his statement in the text of today's briefing. In other words, he constantly answers similar questions. So let's refresh our memory of his statements. So, whether the tape is with us, Ru.
Yes, good afternoon, Maria Vladimirovna. If I may ask two questions. The first question is this. You have already mentioned the statements of Christoph Heusgen about a nightmare for Europe. And the question in this regard is as follows. Actually, Heusgen was talking about a nightmare for Europe in connection with the position of the US administration of Donald Trump. US President Donald Trump, including on Ukraine. And how does the Foreign Ministry assess such statements, especially given the information that has emerged? That Heusgen has real estate in the United States, including during the period when he was the head of the Munich Security Conference.
I think that's what we saw, with these tears. Not to say there's something else that was rubbed on the face. This is a natural conclusion of some kind of inner inhuman bitterness, and, well, really, such a misanthropic ideology, which he professed without being ashamed of his Russophobia.
Такой человеконенавистнической идеологии, которую он исповедовал, не стесняясь своей русофобии.
If you look at and read his statements, and they are all available on the internet, I even have a selection of these monstrous quotes, you will understand that the man lived some kind of, well, I do not know, some kind of special hatred for our country. It wasn't some kind of objective assessment, it was not ideology and rhetoric, at least dividing into those, maybe social groups, or those into political movements, that we are close or not close. He endlessly smeared our entire people, our entire country with general strokes. And it was clear that this was not hatred that arose somehow, in a historical moment. This is not anger in connection with any specific actions, but it's just such terry Russophobia that it's terry nationalism, which apparently feeds on some other roots from the past. And it seems to me that he was not shy about it at all, even emphasized it. Therefore, this current, the Munich Conference, that has just taken place, from which all the participants there have simply gone crazy. She became worthy of his reward. A reward. You see, he himself led this ship, which then, as a result, just so to speak, ran into either an iceberg or rocks. Let them sort it out for themselves. But it is clear that all this is due to an unwillingness to see reality, that all this is because of life. You know, I have the impression that they were looking at the wallpaper, but they thought it was a window. That's the feeling. And at the moment when they needed fresh air, they didn't get it. They suffocated due to the fact that this is not a window at all, but it is really a drawing painted by them on the wall, which they prayed for. You will recall how many times Russian representatives have talked about the need for greater realism, appealing to their Western European colleagues. How many times have we talked about the fact that they deceive themselves, they deceive their peoples? How many times have we given concrete facts and examples? But if they are still, even now, even in the year of the 80th anniversary of the victory, continuing this monstrous anti-historical rhetoric, then comparing our country with the Third Reich, then pejoratively referring to the merits of the Soviet people and the Red Army in the victory, then simply distorting history, placing accents that have absolutely no facts, then they continue to be in these illusions. Is it an illusion, or is it the patient's delirium? These are again questions. It's probably better to ask their countries, their peoples, how they assess it. You ask the question whether his position is biased because of some financial background or because of something else. I do not know. It is difficult for me to say. I have not conducted any investigations. But it seems to me that this is exactly the internal. This is the same kind of nationalist bacillus that they managed. It is much stronger than any financial background. Because so, to speak with such hatred about our country and about our people to a person who lives in the state historically, unfortunately, who inflicted so many troubles and sufferings on our people, and at the same time continue to follow this course of hatred. It seems to me that it's not even about some financial motivation or background. It's just a painful state of this ideology of misanthropy expressed in Russophobia. And why do they say that nationalism, racism, xenophobia is not just bad, but that it is a disease, because you can't get rid of it later? Here you are. Well, of course it is. In my opinion, there is even some metaphysics in this, because there is such a self-revealing action. Then this very Munich Security Policy Conference that we saw in February of the 25th year, all these tears, all these screams, all these stomping, whistling and so on in relation to each other, a friend. It even seems to me that it would be impossible to come up with such a thing in a feature film. They are defeated by their own ideology. That's what I would say, because this ideology is fundamentally destructive. They thought they were going to destroy us, and they destroyed themselves. But it's not our fault, because we have repeatedly told them about this and suggested that they wake up, come to their senses, and return to a constructive dialogue, to a mutually respectful attitude towards each other, to mutually beneficial cooperation. We proposed to build a united Europe. Moreover, we offered to use all the bonuses from our geography, history, and really move on to the formation of such a correct, good, large-scale Eurasianism, kicked out to everyone. They went the other way.
Sean, thank you, and if you can, another second question is also on the topic of the Munich conference of another participant. Actually, Vladimir Zelensky, in an interview with the C News channel, announced an allegedly larger conflict on the territory of Europe this summer, and in particular as involving Russia, and named countries such as Lithuania and Poland as such an option. How can the foreign ministry respond to such statements, and how does the ministry assess such statements?
I didn't hear it again. Lithuania and Poland statements.
Actually, on February 17th, Vladimir Zelensky, in an interview with BBC News, announced an allegedly larger armed conflict on the territory of Europe this summer. And he named such countries as Lithuania and Poland as probable territories.
Well, I do not know. Maybe Vladimir Zelensky, this leader of the junta terrorist organization. Maybe he has plans for either, I don't know, an attack on neighboring countries, on the countries of the European Union, or plans to commit sabotage of terrorist attacks on their territory. Maybe he talked about it. By the way, we have repeatedly warned that he and this Kyiv regime having turned into real tourist cell, including an international one, given the number of foreign mercenaries and the amount of uncontrolled weapons supplied, will then strike at those who are the founding fathers of this unconstitutional community on the territory of Ukraine. And so it happens. We have already talked about this many times. Therefore, he simply warns them that he, so to speak, will commit acts of aggression against them. But this is a classic story of how the West first creates, so to speak, monsters, thinking that it will direct them to solve its own problems. And then it gets terrorism, extremism, and so on from these same monsters. That there were few examples. So we need to clarify what it's about, but I think they should think about it, in principle. It seems to me that he is already unambiguously hinting to them all that, so to speak, he is ready to use all radical means to achieve not even his goals, but his ambitions. And how many times have we talked about the fact that the attacks of the armed forces of Ukraine on nuclear facilities, such as the Zaporozhye nuclear power plant, and not only it alone, are acts of such nuclear terrorism, attempts to commit or use a civilian nuclear facility in order to intimidate, including European leaders. We talk about it all the time. It's not just like that. This is a signal to everyone that they have become so radicalized, so to speak, and they are already in some kind of field of total nihilism, that anything can be expected from them. The main thing is different. The main thing is that this is not only our analysis. Here, you know, we feel absolutely satisfied that all of our calculations, they all have now just this documentary evidence. The question here is that they themselves, I mean the Kyiv regime, are talking about it, not hiding it and doing it. So let's move on. Is the author and with us?
Please tell me, we were certainly shocked by the arrest of Alexander Gaponenko. I took part in the scientific conference Ethnocide of Russian Correspondents Priki as a factor about the preparation for a pro-Russian Russia. It would seem, on the basis of the Institute of the CIS countries, and it would seem that this is a conference, and we talked about science. But nevertheless the Latvian Special Services decided that this is anti-state activity. It is on the principle of national security. Someone on Russia. Of course, the classic kindling of the national area. As you could comment on this message of Russia, like what will you do to us, even with the Trump policy, nothing changes for Russians. Or it will be operators who will also signal to Trump himself that the Latvian Special Services are planning Me6. That we are going to this clearing, and we don't have such a Trump either.
Well, you know, there was a little lost sound. I will put together what I heard about the arrest of scientist Alexander Gaponenko in Riga. Then, of course, this is another action of the ruling Russophobic regime in Latvia to intimidate the Russian-speaking population. Let me remind you that a prominent publicist and human rights activist, Alexander Vladimirovich Gaponenko, was arrested the other day. The reason for the repression was recently the participation of a public figure in a round table on the topic of compatriots in the Baltic states. During the scientific discussion, he, in fact, stated the current sad realities in Latvia. Let me remind you that the authorities are simply carrying out police terror against this ethnic group of permanent residents, that is, against Russians. They're just. And he only confirmed in his speech the assessments that were given earlier by relevant international organizations about, to put it mildly, the unfavorable situation of observing the rights of national minorities in modern Latvia. But for Latvian, well, I would say law enforcement officers first, but still it seems to me that this is a political regime, because law enforcement officers in this case are simply fulfilling an order. That was enough, just a speech at a round table to open a case against him on 2 criminal articles at once. Of course, here we need to talk about Latvia's violation of its obligations under the main international human rights treaties, including the International Covenant on Civil and Political Rights of the 66th year, the Convention on the Protection of Human Rights, Fundamental Freedoms of the 50th year, and, of course, all the obligations that Latvia has assumed within the OSCE. We will closely monitor the fate of a compatriot. We will do everything possible to protect his rights. We will continue to unconditionally and informatively support attention to everything that is available there, because these are real crimes against human rights. It is amazing how, striving for, so to speak, the support of Western states under the pretext of human rights, freedom, democracy, Latvia has turned into a place where no one has heard about these concepts for a long time. Well, it's just from practice, from the realities of the day. So, Lal Medin is with us.
Good afternoon.
Yes, good afternoon.
So, Israel threatened. An Iranian plane was shot down, a civilian plane that flies to Lebanon. This led to chaos in the vicinity of Beirut Airport. How do you assess this act of aggression?
You know, according to available information, in recent days there have been clashes between aggressive citizens in the area of Harel International Airport in Beirut, who protested against the decision taken by the Lebanese authorities not to accept flights from Iran, and clashes with local security forces, including Lebanese army soldiers. On February 14th, 2 Nepalese peacekeepers and members of the UN interim force in Lebanon were injured as a result of riots. The president of the country, the prime minister, the speaker of Lebanon condemned this incident. For our part, we believe that what is happening in the Lebanese Republic is an internal matter. We call upon, and have called upon, and urge the leaders of all influential political forces to strive to resolve differences or issues that cause these differences on the national agenda to resolve in the legal field through the search for mutually acceptable compromises, not to resort to violence. And, of course, it is fundamentally important to prevent Lebanon from stabilizing at the current difficult stage, to preserve political unity, and to ensure the return of this friendly state to the trajectory of sustainable development.
Thank you.
Thank you. Is this Mospost with us? Yes, hello. We have one question today. In connection with the beginning of a constructive dialogue between the Trump administration and Russia, is there any serious progress in easing pressure on our US diplomats? Previously, they repaired various obstacles to work, turned off the internet, and so on. Well, you yourself said in your question, with the beginning of a constructive dialogue, is there any progress? It's just started, because the leadership of the 2 countries was given an impulse. And now, at these moments, delegations are working in a number of parties discussing the whole range of problematic issues. Can you imagine how many of them have accumulated? Not that in 3 years, when, in general, there were no normal contacts at all due to the fault of the former Biden administration, but in all previous years, when they only accumulated. Therefore, we started working. I would like to draw your attention to what they talked about, how they talked, and how this conversation took place. Russian Foreign Minister Sergey Lavrov will tell you during his communication with the press following the events. Thank you. Thank you. Is the voice of the Fatherland with us?
Yes, hello Maria Vladimirovna. So,
I love you.
the question is yes. The question we have is this. Here we are talking about the crime of neo-Nazis in Ukraine. Maybe it's time to start saying directly that this is a crime of the United States of America in Ukraine.
Well, it seems to me that they are already talking about this even in the White House. It seems to me that we have always stressed that those who created the Kyiv regime, those who sponsored it, who supplied weapons, who were the gunner and accomplice of terrorist attacks, cannot be called anything else. We talk about it all the time. It's just that everyone, I'm only talking about briefings now, but look, all the statements of our country, all the interviews of the leadership of the Ministry of Foreign Affairs, our profile experts, revealed the essence of what is happening. But how, if literally with figures, facts on hand, they paid attention to this?
And can today's change in the rhetoric of the United States be another performance to deceive the Russian multinational people? And how do we plan to protect ourselves from this?
To protect yourself from any deception, well, you can know about your national interests in the following way, and work professionally to implement them.
Thank you.
Thank you very much. With this, we say goodbye to you until the next time, and look forward to the news from Iriad, to which, it seems to me, the countries and peoples of our entire planet are chained now. Thank you.